If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. I got this question and topic from one of the participants in the current Attention Compass group training that I'm doing. And the question was, what kinds of things should I be capturing or recording? We're studying capture. What kinds of things should I be putting into my system? And we believe capture is a big deal in the Attention Compass, and you may have heard that in other podcast episodes. And the point is to get all the stuff out of our heads and get it out into a system. So capture is really important. And the emphasis that we give to capture leads people to think through, well, what all can I capture? What should I capture? I think that's an important question. And so we're going to break it down and see if we can arrive at an answer here. What makes sense to capture? Now, the trigger for this particular conversation that I had was my mention that I keep book notes on a lot of books. I'm not 100%, I should be better. And the notion of book notes is pretty self-descriptive. When you read a book, you make notes, and then if you keep a physical copy of the book, you put the notes in the book. There's a little more to it than that, and we'll talk about what it is, but that's what triggered the conversation. Now, the podcast here is, I think book notes are a really good example of the notion of speculative capture or ubiquitous capture. And I'll talk about what that is as we move along. In this discussion, there was a little bit of debate on the usefulness of capturing book notes. And that centered around the efficiency, if you will, of this broad capture of information. And we'll address that. As background, I'll mention we started talking about the broad capture of information 75 years ago now. People have been thinking about this notion of ubiquitous capture, of capturing everything that we notice or everything that we perceive. And we'll break that down. But I'll argue that we may be re-entering phase 3 of this idea with the Meta Ray-Ban smart glass. Now, I'm not sure that ubiquitous capture is the point of that device, but I think it could easily be used for that. Like Google Glass from a decade ago, now that it's actually available, the question is, would it be useful to capture everything? Would that be efficient? How much information should we be trying to keep? And how do we know that we've got it covered? How can we feel comfortable that we've captured all the information that we need to capture? And how much technology should I be using around this? So we'll think about that as we talk today. We'll think about the value of capture and some notes about what all we should be trying to capture in the face of these technological improvements that have an impact. When we're capturing, there are two primary challenges. The first is it's really hard to predict what will be useful. Some stuff is pretty obvious on either side. It's really useful or it's really a waste of time to capture. But the stuff in the middle is sometimes hard to predict. And we want to be efficient because capture does have a cost. Let's talk about what the cost of capture is. There are 3 components. One is the sheer act of capturing it. It's not free. You have to stop and do something to capture information. You have to take a picture, you have to make a note, you have to say something to your assistant but you have to do something. A second component of cost is storing the stuff that you capture. And we'll talk about all this stuff in a little bit. And then the third cost, and this is one that people sometimes overlook, the third cost is review. It's processing the stuff. It's dealing with it once we've captured it. Now, those are the three costs. Of those three, we know that cost two, that is the cost of storage, is falling really rapidly. And we'll talk about that, but the cost of storage is really falling off, and it's been doing that for 20 years now. And so that leaves us with two kind of large components of cost, which is the cost of capture and the cost of review. And I would also argue that the first cost, the cost of capture, is decreasing, not the least of which because of these glasses and technologies like that. Now, this cost is probably not falling as quickly as the cost of storage, but it's still falling due to the development of technology. That leaves us with the third cost, this review cost. I think the review cost is a problem because it's hard to see how the review cost could be anything other than in proportion to the amount of information that we've got captured. It's hard to see how we would shortcut that. If we capture more information, we're going to have more review cost. And so our job in our conversation today is, how do we factor all this in? The more you capture, the more you've got to review, and all of these challenges we face as we begin to capture information in our work. Of course, when we think about ubiquitous capture, that means we capture everything. And that notion goes all the way back to Vannevar Bush, who was a computer scientist in the 40s. And he wrote a paper called As We May Think. And in this paper, he was exploring the notion of what he called a Memex. Memex, that's MEMEX. And that was a term that he used to describe a system that was in his mind. He actually envisioned it as a desk that would use the technology of the time to capture everything the user saw or said or heard. Now, he had the idea that it would be using microfilm and cameras and things like that. He didn't do a detailed design because the technical challenges were there, but he did envision it and think about it. So he was theorizing about this notion of ubiquitous capture, particularly with respect to the computerized processing of the stuff that we were capturing and that we were all sharing. So it was really kind of a thought piece for him. And that goes all the way back to 1949. So we've been thinking about capture for a long time, and how can we record everything? So fast forward to my lifetime, and I've done a significant amount of capture in several different ways. And one of the ways that we'll talk about is back to this notion of book notes. So I'll give some history there. I will say that book notes developed for me in two phases. One is during my Ph.D. program when I was doing Ph.D. kind of reading, and I'll explain all this. And two is when I read a book called How to Read a Book. So we'll talk about both those. But if we come forward a little further, we get into Google Glass, which you may remember, it released in 2013. It had disappointing sales and some real problematic marketing, and it just never took off. Interestingly enough, it wasn't actually retired until 2023 as a product. It was mostly a commercial industrial kind of product, but it wasn't terribly popular in the masses. Now, in the last weeks or couple of months, I've been seeing ads for the Meta smart glasses. Now, the advantage here is they look a lot more like glasses than Google Glass looked. And I think they're intended to support this idea of augmented reality. If you haven't seen these things, they look like a camera, It's got upload capabilities somehow, probably connected to your phone. It's got audio, both microphone and speakers, so you can talk to it and listen to it, and you can say things like, hey, what kind of car am I looking at? And it'll take a picture and it'll try to tell you. If it can do that, then we're simply a storage solution away from being able to have this Memex device. And if we do, then everything we see and everything we hear is captured for us, or at least a copy of it, a photo or a recording. The question is that valuable? Would it be valuable? And it leads to this question that I mentioned earlier, which is, how much stuff should I be capturing? What's the right amount of things to capture? Now, one easy answer, I'll say most people should be capturing more than they currently do. And I'll illustrate by talking about book notes, and then we'll generalize from book notes out into this broader notion of ubiquitous capture. I think of book notes as being a moderate capture habit because I read a lot. And if I'm going to spend the time to read a book, then I might as well spend the time to capture what I think about that. So I gave a little brief history, but I'll go into more detail. One reason why I started thinking about book notes. So in the PhD program, we did PhD level reading. And you might guess what that is. I've mentioned it a few different times in different episodes. It's a huge information management problem because we're reading these 30, 35-page papers, and they're really dense, both with information and with typeface. There's a lot of information in this package, and it would take a significant amount of time to read these things. We might have to read 3 or 4 a week at maybe an hour plus for each one. And me being who I am, I looked heavily into this, said, how do I do this? How do I capture? How do I make notes? How do I highlight? How do I record that I read this document? And the reason I was asking an efficiency question, I needed this because I barely had time to read it the first time. I sure didn't have time to read a paper a second time. So I needed to have the cliff notes. What's in this paper? What does this paper say? Now, I will say at this point, I was already doubting the ability of my 3 pounds of gray goo to keep up with all this. So I wanted to capture it and index it somewhere outside of my skull. Well, if we go back to the idea of a Memex, then it would have been captured automatically. I can imagine wearing this meta glasses saying, hey, I'm about to read for an hour, record what I'm reading. And it would take pictures of the pages, or maybe it would take film, I don't know, that I'm reading, and it would capture it. I might even be able to say things like, well, this is important right here, and point to the book. And that would be getting out from capture even over into the notion of indexing. And we'll talk about this at some length. So that would become ubiquitous, but perhaps episodic capture. I'm saying, hey, capture everything from this point until I tell you to stop. And it's capturing what I'm seeing in the paper. And this is a really interesting idea if you stop. So in this reading world, a second thing happened, and that's I discovered that there are better and worse ways to read. Certainly, I would have told you that I was a really good reader. I've always been told I was a good reader. I like to read. And then I started reading these papers, and I realized, like anything else, I was pretty good at the average human level, but there's lots harder things to do out there. And getting through these papers was one of these hard things. So I was out there struggling with this and just doing the best I could. And I happened across a book called How to Read a Book, which is really, in my mind, is kind of a meta joke, because if you need a book to tell you how to read a book, then you can't read the book to learn how to read a book. So I think the whole meta thing there is just kind of funny and an ironic kind of title. That said, the main thrust of How to Read a Book was how to be a good reader. And it was specifically oriented towards books. So we wanted to be a good consumer of book information, and at least in my mind, towards nonfiction books. So it defined both a process of reading and some different ways to read. So one of the big points was, if you're going to learn how to read a book, then you need to learn how to use the parts of the book. How do you use a book as an information transmission technology? And so, just to give you a sense of what we're talking about here, as an example, books, of course, have a table of contents. And we usually read it to find things, but in order to know you need to find something, then you're probably reading the book the second time. And then you look at the table of contents and you go, oh, well, chapter 6 is about this thing that I'm interested in. Again, let me go there and find what I'm looking for. So that's one way to do it. But the How to Read a book said, well, there's another thing you can do with this table of contents. Before you start reading the book, you can take a really close look at the table of contents. And one of the underlying points of the How to Read a book is that you should have a purpose for reading a book. You should have an intent. And it should be, I need to get some information on a topic. So the better you can define what questions that you're bringing to the book, then the better you're going to be able to comprehend those answers when you see them. And so the book recommends using the table of contents to pose questions for ourselves to answer as we read the book. Hey, I'm here to find out about X. Here's what the table of contents say. That means that the argument's going to be structured this way. Do I understand it, and do I agree with it? Now, there's all kind of other components to the book, the preface, the foreword, all these different parts. One of the biggies, and you'll be aware of this, is the index. Many nonfiction books have an index at the back. Fiction, not so much. And as you know, this is what's called a topical index. And many scholarly books also will have other pieces of bibliography and some version of a notes page. But the topical index is like a very detailed table of contents. So you go in and you find the topics. And it probably wouldn't make as much sense to you, the index, if you hadn't already read the book. Now, the challenge is it's general. It's for the general reader. And it may or may not include the references that make sense to my purpose for reading the book. It may not. If it's exhaustive, it probably does, but if it's exhaustive, it makes it harder to use. So I was reading How to Read a Book, and one of the pieces of advice I ran across is to build your own index for the book. And that's a really interesting thought. It actually said, hey, there's blank pages in the back of the book. Use those and write out your own index. And I thought that was really interesting because it fulfills a lot of the problems that I'm having as I'm trying to capture information. I don't use the back pages of the books. When I take book notes, I take them separately, separate piece of paper, and I organize them, and then I print them out on copy paper, and I stick the copy paper in the book. But I think it's a great idea. If you put your own index inside the book, then you stand a much better chance of not having to read the book again, or at least the whole book, in order to find a piece of information that you suddenly recall is important to you and was in this book. if you're like me, you have a bookshelf, then many of the things that I would like to refer to could have come from more than one of the books. There's lots of books with overlapping subjects. So if I had indexes for all these books, then I could have an index of my own thoughts about the book. And that would give me a better ability to get back to the information quickly. Now, that's the notion of indexing. And it's an important notion when we think about information management. When we go back to the notion of ubiquitous capture, then indexing becomes this fundamental problem. Now, when we say ubiquitous capture, I see a lot of things and I hear a lot of things. I observe a lot of things. And I'm making meaning about them as I see them and hear them. But how do I, if I'm recording the event itself, then two things: how do I record my own thoughts about it? And secondly, how do I index these events so that I can find them or get back to them if I need to? So I worry that any ubiquitous capture is somewhat useless without some top-notch indexing scheme. And I don't see that conversation happening. Book notes are a micro example of that, an example of indexing a large set of real-time information that we individually, I, have made meaning of. One thing I learned from the book notes is that there's one issue with the way that we're taught to read, and it makes book notes a practical challenge. So I'm recommending that you start taking book notes, but I want you to see the challenges. Most of us, I believe, we're taught to read, or at least enticed or encouraged to read, just for pleasure, for entertainment, and not so much for information. And I think that's pretty common. It may just be me, but I think it's pretty common for us to be taught using fiction. And so I think most of our training of how to read is based on reading fiction. And I'll say that that encourages us to develop habits that are not conducive to reading for information. I'll identify two primary issues here. So one is mental. If we're reading fiction, then we're probably reading for pleasure or entertainment. And so we don't have this expectation of gaining value in information terms. So we're not trained to look for it when we see it. For example, you're not trained to go to a book and ask a book questions. So when we read for pleasure, we're just looking for hours to disappear. And maybe we come away with some new story, or we can brag to our friends that we read War and Peace. And that's what we get out of reading for pleasure. Certainly, I don't mean to say that that's not a good goal. It's just very different than reading for information. It's more like how we currently use movies. So that gives us certain habits, and these habits around the physical act of reading makes taking notes really challenging. You probably were not taught to read sitting at a desk. You were probably taught to read sitting in a comfortable chair with your elbows up on the arms of the chair. You're probably taught decent lighting. So that's a challenge. And in fiction, you can kind of get the story in your head and it's easy to remember. That's one of the purposes of story in our lives, is so that we remember things. That's versus nonfiction. So when I say nonfiction, I'm talking about the common kind of nonfiction, specifically not textbooks, because textbooks are weird. I'm not going to talk about them, but they're weird. When I say nonfiction, I'm talking about the kind of book where scientists write popular science and explain things to us. And my intent with these books is very different than it is with fiction. I want to learn something. I want to capture information and change the way I think. And in order to do that well, I want to create an index. And that means I've got to keep notes of what I'm reading when I read it. Or if I want to refer back to this information, I got to know where it came from so I can refer back to it effectively. Now, we do have some techniques for doing this, like highlighting in the book. So we get out a highlighter and we do that. We learned that largely from textbooks, I believe. And with electronic books, our techniques have expanded some and gotten a little bit easier. In some ways, it's much easier to highlight in an electronic book than it is in a paper book, if for no other reason, because you don't have to have the highlighter. Now, I'm most familiar with the Kindle as an e-reader, and you can highlight things and export book notes and capture them on their servers and then export them out to other systems. And I really think there's lots of good things going on there, but I don't think we're all the way there. There are still some technical challenges. So quite often, in fact, mostly, I'm still using paper to capture my book notes. For most of the books that I read, I don't keep book notes, and that's a failing on my part. I'm in a hurry. But in the electronic world, I tend to think about it more. But in the electronic world, the tools are different. So I will say, Kindle people out there, if you're listening, I think there's a whole lot more you can do with your apps. And I, for one, would appreciate it. E-reader users, if you got a reading app that you love that does a good job with this, shoot me an email. I'd love to hear your suggestion on a good reading app. Now, my goal is really to be able to develop my own index for the book and to manage that somehow, particularly maybe in a cross book sense. So be able to say, here's a topic for an index and it's in these 4 books. I don't care so much about usability or the form factor. And then bonus points if it'll run on an iPad rather than needing a specific advice. But if you've studied this, I would love to hear from you. Drop me a comment or shoot me an email or whatever. But I would love to hear some research here. That said, as I mentioned before, I usually just have paper and pen because it's easy. And that means I can't really sit in a recliner and do what I need to do to take these notes. And that's back to this idea of learning to read using fiction. Sitting in a recliner with a fiction book is fine if you don't need to take notes. But if you do need to take notes, then my experience is you're better off at a desk or a table so you can handle the paper and the pen and not be writing on your lap. Okay. But we have bad habits around this. The places where we read are not conducive to managing the information. So I got this paper and pen. When I'm done, I'll get the notes together and I'll reorganize them and try to make them more concise about what I've learned from the book, and then print it out, put it in the back of the book. And what I'm actually doing is indexing. I've consumed this information at some level and I'm indexing it so that I can efficiently get back to the part of the book that I might need to refer to more precisely for other purposes. So we look at that consumption and management of information and draw parallels out into the bigger world of ubiquitous capture. As I mentioned, I don't think we're far away from the point of ubiquitous capture. I think that the recording and maintenance of any complete record of our lives is quite attainable. It might be a little expensive at first, but it's not beyond the technology that we have in place now. But indexing remains a challenge. I don't think we've developed a good way to do it. And any increase in the amount of capture that's done on our behalf or that we do is going to fail without good indexing. Let me back up, okay? It's not common knowledge that you should build your own index for nonfiction books that you read. That's not common knowledge. And similarly, I would suspect that it wouldn't be common knowledge that you would need to index your Memex, your record of your life, so to speak. And again, This indexing is the costly part of the process. It's not the technology, that's relatively cheap. So we want to be economical with our indexing. And again, this goes back to the cost of indexing increasing with the amount of information needing to be indexed. So we're reading for more than just entertainment, despite the fact that we've been taught to read in an entertainment context. I'm not positive that we've ever read solely for entertainment, because one of the first books published was the Bible. I don't think many people have read the Bible just for entertainment, and I'm a Bible student. Now, when fiction showed up, we might have started reading primarily for entertainment purposes. But reading for entertainment and for education are very different things. I've mentioned this. And the notion of capture and indexing bring these two different goals out quite clearly. The big deal is we're utilizing our brains when we read a book. Even now, unless you go all the way to academic papers, books are the best source of scientific, actionable, rational information and knowledge. Now, we can see a time, all of us can forecast a time when this kind of information is going to be out of books. We're going to be done with books into the web. And it's already moving that direction, and I think we can see that. But I think this will increase the need for indexing and not decrease it. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. Our brains are somewhat unreliable because our memories are somewhat. So when we consume information, it's hard to remember it. And then the other piece is it's very difficult for us to know what we're going to need later. So we don't know what we're going to wish we had captured or wish we had indexed. So there's two problems. One is we try to remember it with a faulty memory, and two is we try to guess what we're going to need with faulty guessing. Now, I don't think we can usefully index the meaning that we make out of all this information. And by that, I mean, I'm not sure there's a technology that allows us to index it. I realize we can apply AI, and we can develop, on the one hand, we can do AI. And on the other, we can develop ways to make things searchable. But an AI created index and or a full text search are very different things than an index I've created on my own. So for example, it's easy now to get a transcript of audio. This was not true 15 years ago. And a transcript is searchable because it's text. So technology has intervened and made audio more searchable through an intermediary process. So, for example, in this podcast, I can record these episodes and get a transcript of them, and then I can search back and say, oh, okay, in episode 36, I talked about X, Y, and Z. Now, the biggest challenge of that is associating that text transcript with the audio file and with the posts online. And I probably should be doing a better job of that with my website. So we can do it. We can make it more searchable using technology. Now, I'm using book notes and PhD reading particularly as an example of this broader capture than I think most people typically do. Now, one of the challenges that we face in creating index is we're moving to this media-less situation. And if we don't have media, then where do we keep the indexes? And this goes back to what I was saying before about where do I keep the searchable text for a podcast episode? You'll put it out on the webpage? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe I want you all to have access to it. Maybe I don't. Right? So the same thing is true as we get out to media-lessness. A similar problem is if there's a book on a physical book on my bookshelf, then I've got a pretty good idea I've read it. That's just my habit. That may not be true in your world, but I've read them if they're on my bookshelf, because if I haven't read it, I won't keep it there. And if I've read it and don't like it, I won't put it there. So there's a record of books that I've read, and that's more important than you might think. But when I'm out on the internet, what's the record that I've seen this video? Where's the record that I've indexed the information in this video and don't need to watch it again? I can go to my index or my notes. Okay. And if we think about information as an input and our attention as applied to understanding that information as a resource that has a cost, then all of a sudden it gets very, very important that we not spend time to consume YouTube video twice, unless it's just for entertainment purposes. So we're getting out into this idea of ubiquitous capture, both ubiquitous in terms of everything and ubiquitous in terms of, say, media-based and media-lessness. Again, we can associate physical notes with a physical book, and we can associate electronic notes with an electronic book. But this cross-book awareness is still a problem. And it's also a problem to how do you associate an index with a URL to a video that you watched? So all that's a part of this challenge, and we haven't yet built tools to solve this. At the end of the day, it's how do I store what I've taken away from interacting with somebody else's presentation of information? And that's the problem that ubiquitous storage is envisioned to help us overcome. The notion is if you capture anything, you can always get back to it if for no other reason than just search. Well, search is not as useful as we think. And this idea of capturing more and more information presumes that indexing is somehow free. I think it's not, and I don't think it can be. I don't think indexing is a technical problem. As an example, let's consider some AI-based indexing solution. And we have these already. Zoom will give you a summary of the recording of a Zoom meeting, and that's intended to be an index of the meeting. But it assumes that AI works the way your brain works, or it assumes that there are some very precise and specific rules for how to pull summaries out of spoken text. And I don't think either one of those things is true. If you want to test it, go read a book. You write your index and then let AI index it for you. And I'd imagine that you're going to come up with two pretty different indexes, because you're going to notice things from your own experience and things that are important to you. So another problem is this role of technology, and we're struggling with this even as we speak, because we're thinking about how useful it might be to make an index of your life. So we're talking about this phase one, phase two, and I'm saying book notes are kind of one phase here. But another potential phase one came along with the rise of remote meetings. So this is phase one in this capture problem, and it illustrates for us the problems that we're going to face. And it was with the rise of remote meetings, because it wasn't a thing before meetings got to be remote. Well, it was a thing, but it was of questionable legality. And here's my point. We no longer think too much of recording a Zoom meeting. There was a little bit of time while it was kind of icky, and a few people will still object a little bit, but mostly what they're objecting to is being recorded on camera, their picture being recorded. They don't care so much about their voice or their words. So going back to when we first started working remotely during COVID, phase one was, let's record these meetings. And if you went home during COVID, you were having these Zoom meetings, you probably recall it. Somebody'd say, hey, let's record this. Okay, fine. It's basically free. And then people would say, hey, if you're going to record the meeting, could you send me a copy? Well, I'm happy to send you a copy, but it's kind of a pain in the butt because it's a really big file. And sending really big files is not trivial. So what are you going to do with it? And they'd say, well, I don't know. I just want to have it. Well, wait a minute. If you just have it, why? Are you going to take the time to listen to it again? So, to give you some context here, I'll sit in a 30 or 45-minute meeting with a piece of paper and a pen, and I'll take away 2 or 3 or 4 actionable items, and that's pretty much it. Now, it's not the most efficient thing I've ever done in my life, but I don't think that the information content of a meeting is particularly well disguised or so thick and rich that I can't capture what I need to capture in real time. And if I'm able to do that, then what would be the point of going back and listening to a recording of a meeting I attended? Who has time for that? I certainly don't. Well, now technology, we've got sites like Otter that attend the meetings, and instead of giving us an audio and video recording, they give us transcripts. I use Otter as my transcript service, and I can send it to a meeting, and it records, and at the end, it has both the transcript, the written, and an associated audio file that is timed up with the transcript. It's really cool. I love it. So I can go to a particular part of the transcript and click play, and I'll hear the actual audio. So fast forward a little bit, what's happening now is a lot of people have set their transcription service up so that it looks at their calendar and attends all the meetings that they have. Many times I'm in meetings with the avatar or the transcription service before the other human gets there. Me being me, I've asked people who were doing this, are you doing anything with those transcriptions? The most common response is no. Frankly, I had forgotten that I had invited a transcription service to begin with. I've been meaning to turn it off because people ask about it and I really don't use it. And I get it. I get the drive. You barely had time to attend the meeting the first time. But what that means is you sure don't have time to go read a transcript of the meeting afterwards. And again, in order to save time, we need to do capture and indexing, but indexing takes time as well. Okay. So that was kind of another potential phase one, is people sending these transcription services. Phase one, that is, of this notion of ubiquitous capture. Phase two of this, Zoom is doubling down, and it's currently in beta, but Zoom will now allow you to record a video avatar of yourself, and it'll use AI, and you can send your video avatar and your transcriber to a meeting. And your avatar will apparently respond in the meeting and react in the meeting, and it'll take a transcript, and you get the transcript back so you can read the transcript without having to attend the meeting. And this is a weird idea for me. Am I trying to fool people into thinking that I attended the meeting? If so, why am I doing that? And if I don't fool them and they somehow recognize that it's an avatar, exactly how much trouble am I going to get in? And after all of that, do I actually read the transcript that I get? I didn't have time to attend the meeting. What makes me think I'm going to have time to read and understand the transcript? And so it's weird for me. We're getting into this skip the meeting culture with the idea that we'll get the information through some transcript. But all this is a challenge. We're starting to try to face this ubiquitous capture and the associated indexing problem in the real world. And that is, how do we use this technology? On the one hand, if artificial intelligence can attend a meeting for me, then I'm a little bit concerned about the value that I'm providing in my job and whether or not I'm going to continue to be worth employed. On the other hand, assuming it becomes okay, how do we manage it? How do we index this stuff? Is there some way to do it? And before you say AI, I mentioned this earlier. I don't know how AI would do it. I don't know that AI would do it the same way I would do it. and there's no clear rules about how to get it done. We talked about phase 1 and phase 2. So phase 3 then is this Memex-like system capability that we now have with these glasses. I'm not sure that ubiquitous captures the goal, but it is certainly reasonable. And we all know how technology works. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see that as a use case sometime in the not too distant future. And it's really intriguing, but I would argue that it really still has this indexing problem. And I don't know that technology, that AI is a useful approach to the indexing problem. It comes down to how much do I trust AI to think like I think and interpret things the way I interpret things? Or is that my special sauce that makes me valuable in and convinces people to pay me for my engagement and stuff? So, purpose of this episode is to stop and think about, okay, what about the technology? What about capture? And there are more questions. What should I capture? What should I not capture? How should I use technology to help me with my capture? Even if you rule out this ubiquitous capture notion, you still need to capture. And I think people are going to fall into this without thinking about it. And I think, you send an avatar to a meeting, I don't know. And at best, it's terrible etiquette. But we've sacrificed etiquette to other goals in the business. So the question is, do we use the technology in these ways? And my view is just because we could doesn't mean we should. So I want to think through the value. If I'm going to send an avatar to meetings, then where's the indexing coming from? If I have to index it myself, am I actually saving time? Or am I just applying technology to solve a problem that the technology really can't solve? So think about that as we go forward. Other questions: what and how much should we capture? I think book notes are a good pilot case, and I think they're generally a good idea. I think if you're going to invest 12 hours in reading a 300-page nonfiction book trying to learn something, then it's a good idea to take the additional few minutes and put together some book notes for yourself, so that if you need to, you can go back and you can say, okay, here's what I was thinking when I read this book. Of course, the other side of that coin is, if you're going to be a reader, then think about becoming a better reader. How could you become a better reader? Well, one idea is to approach a book with one or more pretty precise questions in your head, and maybe even written down, and think about whether or not the book can answer those questions for you. Another idea, if you're really captivated by this notion, then go pick up a copy of How to Read a Book. So it was written in the 40s, but there's new editions and copies out there, and it will teach you something about how to do a better job of capturing information from the printed book format. But the primary point of this episode is to consider book notes as a rudimentary form of ubiquitous capture, and use that to help us figure out these pros and cons. Again, the notion of ubiquitous capture, at least in my mind, is based on this idea that if we capture it all, then we don't have to worry about overlooking something that was important to us. Well, we've already got enough data that we can and do overlook things all the time. And so I don't think ubiquitous capture is going to help. Pile and search, probably not going to work here. And that's where this idea of indexing comes in. And indexing is really valuable. Not only is it a note of where information is in a text, but it's also a way to notice what's important to you as a reader and what meaning you make from the information in the text. We know it's one thing to capture information, and it's another thing to understand it. And it's not too dissimilar from people who have shelves full of books they haven't read. We're all aware that buying a book doesn't give you the knowledge that's in the book. But in the same way, recording an event that you didn't participate in may or may not tell you what happened at the event. So this whole indexing questions, making meaning is a big, big deal. So I would suggest that you keep an eye on that. And then I said, if you get out there and experiment with some of this stuff, I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on these Ray-Bans. If there's a review you want to point me to, I'd love to see it. I understand how cool it is, but what's the value? So if there's a good review out there, I'd love to see it. Share it with me. Hit me, Larry at dobusyright.com, or connect with me on LinkedIn. Also, if you got other thoughts, hit me up. Let's start a discussion here. Okay? Love to talk with you about this stuff. So let's recap real quick. What did we talk about? Well, we talked about this whole notion of capture. We used the idea of book notes to talk about the challenges around ubiquitous capture. Along the way, I've explained what book notes are and why I think they're useful. You might want to think about beginning to do that. Learn how to do that with your books so you don't have to reconsume the information from scratch. We talked about how technology is proceeding and how it's eminently realistic that the Memex device could become a real thing. I don't have any evidence of that's what Meta is trying to do, but it is eminently doable. And we know technology, and if something is doable, then it's likely that it's going to get done. So somebody out there is thinking, I just wear my glasses all the time and I go through my life and I get home and I think about it and process against it, and that's going to make me more efficient. Well, I'm not sure that's true. Are you going to have time to do that? If you're not, then who's going to process it for you? If you're thinking AI, well, we talked about that. Who's going to make sense of it if not you? Or am I better off just doing in real time to the best of my ability of tracking what I think is important and tracking the meaning that I'm making and getting better at doing it that way? Then I've got more time for more experiences, and I'm not wasting my time reviewing information that I was present for. So we're thinking about what's the efficiency horizon, where's the trade-off here? And again, if you're trying some of these sorts of things, I'd love for you to join the conversation. That said, if you don't do book notes, give them a try. If you're a reader, give book notes a try. I think you'll find they're very useful, but they're not trivial to generate. So just understand that as you go. And if you're out there with e-reader software and you understand what's going on and you think you got a great lead on a piece of e-reader that helps with this, I'd love to hear from you as well. So all that to say, that's kind of our summary. We've thought about some of these things. I think we've identified some costs that we'll need to bear, and maybe a warning against just automatically falling into this notion of ubiquitous capture. So I hope that's helpful. If you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, I'm not hard to find. Or again, I've given you my email address a couple of times. Reach out. Love to hear from you. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.